All right, guys, good morning, everyone. On today's agenda, we're going to start discussing logic statements. Logic statements are also known as conditional statements. Conditional statements are used in mathematics, they're used in law, and they're usually used to prove whether statements are true. You can use them to know if someone is lying, and you can use them to use logic to prove a point. And they're very useful in mathematics, and we're not going to get too deep into conditional statements, but we're just going to introduce the preliminary about conditional statements. Some of those preliminary or basic things about conditional statements are that they are called if-then statements. So a conditional statement is also known as an if-then statement, or P to Q, a P to Q statement. The if is the P part, the then is the Q part. That means that if P happens, then Q happens. That is what a conditional statement is. We're also going to talk about what a hypothesis of a statement is, what a conclusion of a statement is, what a negation of a statement is. The first thing that we should know is that there are four kinds of statements. There is your conditional statement. And the conditional statement is always the given statement. It is a statement that you start with. It is a statement that they give you. It is a statement that they present to you. And a conditional statement, then we have the inverse statement. The inverse can be made from the conditional. Then we have the converse statement. And again, it's the converse of the conditional. And finally, we have the contrapositive, which is the contrapositive of the conditional. So we always start with our conditional statement, and then they will ask us for the inverse of the conditional, the converse of the conditional, or the contrapositive of the conditional. Let's take a look at some examples. A conditional statement is simply denoted by if P happens, then Q will happen. Those are the conditions. It's almost like when you go to the pizza shop, the pizza owner tells you, I will give you a pizza if you give me $2. If P happens, then Q will happen. If you give me a pizza, then I will give you $2. Right? That's what you say. That's what you say to the pizza owner when you go to the store. If P happens, then Q will happen. This is my conditional statement. And a conditional statement could be any kind of statement. Okay? For this example, let's use this example. If you see lightning, then you hear thunder. If you see lightning, then you hear thunder. That is my condition. The condition says that if you see lightning, then you will hear thunder. Not you may, not you might, not maybe. A conditional statement says that if you see lightning, then you are going to hear thunder. That is my conditional statement. Well, we can do the inverse of the conditional, we can do the converse of the conditional, and we can also do the contrapositive of the conditional. Let's do the inverse first. Let's do the inverse of my conditional. The inverse of my conditional would be then that it is the negation of the original statement. The inverse is the negation of the original statement. It's the negating. So it's like if someone asks you, did you do your homework? And you did it, but you say, no, I didn't do it, then you're negating that statement, like saying, no, I didn't do it. Or if someone asks you, did you do your homework? And you didn't do it, and you say yes, then you're negating the fact that you didn't do it. So the inverse is the negation of my conditional statement. And the inverse will look like this. If P doesn't happen, then Q won't happen either. That's the inverse. If P doesn't happen, then Q won't happen. So we can see here that my conditional statement says that if P happens, then Q will happen. Well, the negation of this, negating this statement, or the inverse of this statement, is if P doesn't happen, then Q won't happen. So that's the inverse of my conditional. Now, let's talk about, let's refer it to our example. The inverse of if you see lightning, then you hear thunder is going to be, if you don't see lightning, then you won't hear thunder. If you don't see lightning, then you won't hear thunder. That is the inverse of my conditional. That is the negation of my conditional. Now, let's look at the converse. The converse says that if Q happens, then P happened. If Q happened, then P happens. So notice the conditional is if P happens, then Q happens. Well, the converse is if Q happens, then P happens. It's kind of like the reverse of your scenario of your conditional statement. It's the flipping of your conditional statement. If Q happens, then P happens. So in other words, if you hear thunder, then you see lightning. If you heard thunder, then you must have seen the lightning. And that is the converse of my conditional. Because the original statement says that if you see lightning, then you hear thunder. But the converse of that is going to be that if you hear thunder, then you see lightning. And finally, we have the contrapositive of the conditional. We have the contrapositive. And the contrapositive states that if Q doesn't happen, then P doesn't happen. If Q doesn't happen, then P doesn't happen. That means that now you've taken your scenario, you've flipped it, and you've also negated it. So let's take a look here at an example of contrapositive. If my original statement is, if you see lightning, then you hear thunder, well then my contrapositive is going to be, if you, oops, I forgot to write it down. Give me 1 second to write it down, guys. If the contrapositive is the flipping and the negating of our conditional statement, well then it's going to be if Q doesn't happen, then P doesn't happen. Meaning then that if you didn't hear thunder, or if you don't hear thunder, if you don't hear thunder, let me put if in quotations because that's a conditional, then what's going to happen? Well, if you don't hear thunder, then you won't see lightning. So the contrapositive is the switching and negating of my conditional statement. So if you don't hear thunder, then you won't see lightning. Then you won't see lightning. Now, there's a little part that we haven't talked about yet, and it's pretty simple, and I'm sure you guys are probably familiar with these two terms. Let's take a look at my conditional statement. My conditional statement says that if you see lightning, then you hear thunder. The if portion of my conditional statement is called the hypothesis. I'm hypothesizing if something happens. And the then portion is known as the conclusion. This is what's going to happen if my if at the end of my hypothesis. So the first portion is called the hypothesis, the last portion is called the conclusion. Okay? Now let's try writing some